The fluorescent lights hum above the nurses' station at St. Michael's in Atlanta, a sound like electricity trapped in glass, and Natalie Hayes checks vitals with a kind of mechanical precision that comes from muscle memory older than her nursing license. Her movements are economical. Exact. She adjusts the blood pressure cuff on a post-operative patient with one hand while documenting with the other, her touch gentle but efficient, the way someone handles equipment they've maintained under pressure for more than a decade. The patient, a woman recovering from a knee replacement, watches her with the soft gratitude people reserve for someone who actually looks at them instead of through them. "Has your pain level?" Natalie asks, her voice pitched low, steady as a metronome. Most nurses ask questions while scanning their phones. Natalie waits for the answer. 4 out of 10, the woman says. "Better than this morning." "Good. That's the right trajectory." Natalie makes a note. She doesn't oversell reassurance. She doesn't need to. There's something in her bearing that signals she knows exactly what she's talking about, that she's seen worse, that a 4 out of 10 in her presence means something different than a 4 out of 10 in someone else's. The patient's shoulders drop slightly. The anxiety metabolizes into something manageable. At the nurse's station, 3 residents cluster around the morning board, their voices bright with the particular exhaustion of the overnight shift. One of them, a third-year named Chen, glances at Natalie with a question about a laceration repair that came through at 2 a.m. The wound is clean but borderline for simple closure. "Sutures or adhesive?" Chen asks. "Sutures," Natalie says without looking up from her charting. "Forehead laceration. Tension on that area. Adhesive won't hold." Chen nods. He's learned not to ask why. Natalie has never been wrong about wound closure, and she explains nothing, volunteers no extra information, just provides the answer with the confidence of someone whose hands have held together injuries in places where infection meant amputation. She returns to her charting as if the conversation never happened, but Chen is already updating his orders, already confident in a decision that came from nowhere official, from no credential visible on a badge, just from someone who knows. The ER smells like it always does, antiseptic layered over something chemical, something human. Latex. Saline solution. The faint copper undertone of blood that soap never completely removes. Natalie has stopped noticing the smell the way you stop noticing the hum of the lights. It's the texture of her day now, has been for 3 years since the Pentagon erased Captain Natalie Hayes from every database and told her to disappear into a civilian name and a job that let her keep helping people without asking questions that couldn't be answered. She reaches for her jacket, draped over a chair in the break room. Her fingers trace the outline of the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, hidden against the fabric where no one would ask questions. 5th Special Forces Group. The patch is worn at the edges, the colors bleeding into each other like a photograph left in the sun. She doesn't remove the jacket. Just touches it through the material, a gesture that takes maybe 2 seconds, unconscious as breathing. A reminder. A tether. Evidence that the woman in scrubs pushing a medication cart was once someone else entirely. The break room is empty except for the refrigerator's low industrial wine. Someone's lunch is growing science experiments in a Tupperware container. Someone else left a mug on the counter, white ceramic, the words "World's Best Mom" faded to grey from 1,000 washings. There's a photo tucked into the frame of the bulletin board beside it, the kind of glossy military portrait that smells like brass polish and obligation. The man in the photo is in dress blues, his cover perfect, his expression the particular exhaustion of someone who knows exactly what he's signed up for. Captain Thomas Hayes. KIA, Helm and Province, 2019. 5 years ago. Natalie looks at the photo the way she looks at her own hands during a crisis, as data, as information, as something that exists but doesn't require comment. She fills her mug with coffee that tastes like it was brewed sometime during the previous administration, adds nothing to it, and returns to the floor. By 9 in the morning, the ER has shifted into the rhythm of day shift. The overnight emergencies have either stabilized or been admitted, and now there's the slower accumulation of the genuinely injured, the moderately sick, the worried well. Natalie moves through it all with the same steady precision. A diabetic with a foot infection. A child with an ear that probably hasn't been infected in 3 days but still needs evaluation. A construction worker with a crush injury that's actually minor but makes his eyes wide with the particular fear of someone who thought he was about to lose his hand. To each of them, Natalie brings something that the job description doesn't quantify. She positions the diabetic so his leg drains properly without him asking. She explains to the child's mother, in language that sounds like genuine belief rather than script, that the ear will be fine. To the construction worker, she says, "Hand looks good. Full function. You're going home with this." Not "you'll be fine." Something more specific. Something that lands like fact rather than comfort. A junior resident named Marcus, first rotation, still carrying the particular brightness of someone who hasn't yet learned that medicine is mostly about managing failure, watches Natalie demonstrate the proper way to tape a sprained ankle. His own technique was sloppy, the tape too tight across the arch, the tension uneven. Natalie takes the tape from his hands with a gesture that isn't quite gentle but isn't critical either. Just efficient. Tape should stabilize without restricting circulation, she says, her hands moving with the precision of someone whose muscle memory has been earned under conditions he can't imagine. Feel right here. She guides his fingers to the patient's ankle. You should be able to slip one finger under the tape. That's the margin. You go tighter, you're creating a tourniquet. Marcus watches her hands. They're scarred. Not accident scars, deliberate ones, the kind that come from working in places where skin splits open against equipment that wasn't designed for comfort. Some of the scars disappear under her sleeve when she reaches. How do you learn that? Marcus asks. Natalie is already moving to the next patient. Practice, she says, which is true and says nothing. But that isn't the worst part. At 10:41 a.m., the ER doors open and Dr. Mercer enters like someone stepping onto a stage he's already designed. His white coat is pristine, his credentials sewn onto his pocket in gold thread like medals nobody asked him to wear. He's surrounded by residents, 3 of them, maybe 4, it's hard to count when they're all orbiting the same gravity well. He's telling a story about a case he handled, something complex and technical, and the residents laugh at the appropriate moments because they've learned that this is what advancement looks like. Laughter at exactly the right pitch. Attention that feels like hunger. Dr. Mercer is tall in the way that matters in a hospital, which is to say his height is somehow compounded by the fact that he knows he's tall. He has the particular confidence of a man who has never been told he's wrong by anyone with institutional power. His hairline is receding but he's chosen not to be bothered by it, the way some men wear that particular vulnerability like it's armor. He's held every position he's wanted. Published in journals that people actually read. Given talks in cities with names like Boston and San Francisco. He is, by every metric that hospitals measure, successful. What he cannot understand is why Natalie Hayes, who has no publications and no speaking engagements and whose last promotion was 3 years ago and led nowhere, somehow commands a kind of respect that his white coat and credentials have never quite purchased. He sees her now, at the medication station, drawing up something, a narcotic probably, the way her hand moves with that economical precision. She doesn't see him yet, or she does and she's chosen not to register it, which he understands is somehow worse. Acknowledgement would be something. A flinch. A straightening of posture. A tell that she knows she's being looked at. Instead, she finishes drawing the medication, labels the syringe with handwriting that looks like it was printed by a machine, and moves to a patient's room without ever breaking her rhythm. One of the residents says something to Dr. Mercer, and he smiles. It's the kind of smile that doesn't touch his eyes, the kind that predators wear when they've identified something that doesn't know it's being hunted yet. Who's the nurse? He asks, his tone casual, which means it isn't casual at all. Hayes, one of the residents says. She's good. Really good. Saved a guy last year who came in looking dead. Intubated him before the attending even got there. Dr. Mercer files this information away. Good. That's useful. Good means competent. Competent means she's not just doing a job, she's doing it better than people with twice her credentials, and that's a problem he's going to solve. Not today. Not with any particular hurry. But systematically. The fluorescent lights hum above the nurse's station, patient monitors beat their steady rhythm, and Natalie Hayes checks the next set of vitals with the same steady precision, completely unaware that the particular competence everyone respects in her has just marked her for an opponent who measures success in a different currency entirely. She touches the patch inside her jacket later, during the afternoon lull, fingers tracing the faded embroidered letters. 5 years since Helmand Province. 5 years since Captain Natalie Hayes was buried. 5 years of being just a nurse, which was supposed to be enough, which was supposed to be safe. But safety was always an illusion, and she's learned better. The conference room at St. Michael's felt smaller when it was full. 30 residents sat in tiered rows, pens poised above notepads, the fluorescent lights humming their electric song. The air tasted like antiseptic and ambition. Dr. Mercer stood at the front, holding a chart like it was evidence at trial, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Here we have a cautionary example of inadequate documentation," he said, turning the pages so everyone could see Natalie's handwriting. Nurse Hayes apparently believes brevity equals competence. The residents chuckled. Small laughs, the kind that build confidence in a room. Natalie stood against the back wall, her hands folded in front of her. She wore the same face she wore during difficult intubations, present, calm, operating from a place that had learned to survive worse than embarrassment. She took one measured breath through her nose. Held it for 4 counts. Released it. Notice the lack of supplemental detail, Dr. Mercer continued, gesturing at her notes with the dismissiveness of a man who had never had to write documentation while running a trauma code. The absence of what I would consider thorough assessment. One might wonder how she makes clinical decisions at all. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Dr. Mercer. Not with trembling fingers. Not with shame. With the precision of someone removing a drop of blood from a gloved hand. Her jaw tightened slightly, the only visible crack in the porcelain. The room noticed the tear. The room always noticed. "Perhaps," Natalie said, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel through skin, "if you spent less time performing for an audience and more time with patients, you'd recognize competent care when you saw it." The fluorescent lights buzzed. Someone's pen fell. Dr. Mercer's smile froze, then hardened into something that looked more like a threat. His eyes locked with hers for 2 full seconds, a standoff measured in heartbeats, before he turned back to the residents as if she hadn't spoken, as if she was already invisible. "Any questions?" he asked pleasantly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Natalie turned and walked out of the conference room. Her boots made no sound on the tile, which was the problem. Quiet people could be forgotten. Quiet people could be erased. But Dr. Mercer had just learned what quiet people already knew: sometimes silence was the most dangerous response of all. The fact that he didn't understand this yet made him dangerous in a different way, the way of men who'd been handed authority and mistook it for power. She didn't go home. Going home meant sitting in an apartment where the walls still held the shadow of someone who wasn't coming back. Instead, she worked a double shift, moving through the ER with the same methodical precision that had kept her alive in places where one mistake meant someone else's wife wouldn't see them again. She changed dressings. She ran blood work. She talked a woman down from a panic attack using techniques that came from somewhere classified and never discussed. By the time the shift ended, her feet ached and her chest felt like it was made of concrete, but the pain was information. Pain meant she was still functioning. 2 weeks later, she stood at the vending machine in the staff lounge, feeding dollar bills into the slot with the mechanical focus of ritual. The surgical resident she'd mentored, the young man whose dissertation she'd helped edit, whose trembling hand she'd guided through his first complex case, walked past her without acknowledgement. He looked away. The message was clear: being seen with her was now a liability. Dr. Mercer appeared beside her like a thought she couldn't suppress. "Natalie, I've been hearing concerns," he said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. The most dangerous tone a man like him could use. Where exactly did you train? She selected her coffee. Watched it fall into the dispenser with a metallic clink. Georgia State. It's in my file. Of course, he said, too pleasantly. Though I'm sure you understand why security escorts are standard protocol for staff whose backgrounds raise concerns. The words were a blade wrapped in velvet. Her background. As if competence could be questioned by paperwork alone. As if her hands, which had held people together in conditions that officially didn't exist, could be judged by where a diploma came from. She took her coffee and left him standing there. But the poison was already in the water. Dr. Mercer began his campaign with the precision of someone who understood institutional power the way musicians understand scales. He didn't yell. He didn't make overt accusations. Instead, he cultivated questions, the kind that spread through staff lounges like infection. He called himself our mystery nurse when she passed him in hallways, his voice light, joking, the kind of remark that invited others to wonder along with him. He asked loud questions in the break room. Anyone actually verify her credentials? Has anyone seen her training documentation? I'm just asking because the board takes these things seriously. His tone suggested he was asking on behalf of institutional integrity, not from spite. He golfed with the hospital board members on Saturday mornings, mentioned procedural irregularities and unusual background concerns over scotch that cost more than Natalie made in a week. He said it casually, as if worried, as if he'd rather not have to bring it up. The board members, men in their 60s with corner offices and the assumption of authority that came from never being questioned, began to wonder. They asked the nursing director about her. The nursing director, wanting to be thorough, wanting to protect the hospital from liability, began to look more carefully at Natalie's file, began to ask questions of her own. Other staff felt the shift. It was subtle, the way a room's temperature changes when someone opens a window. People who had worked beside her for years began keeping distance. The young nurses who had come to her for guidance started asking other senior nurses instead. Someone suggested, gently, that maybe Natalie's shift schedule could be adjusted. Someone else mentioned that they'd heard St. Michael's was thinking about restructuring the ER, which usually meant layoffs for newer hires, or in this case, hires whose backgrounds raised concerns. Natalie felt it like pressure building behind her sternum. Like the pressure that built before a storm. Like the pressure before an ambush. The thing about being hunted is that you develop an awareness of it, a sixth sense that tells you when eyes are on you, when whispers are happening in rooms you're not in. She'd learned this skill in places that didn't have names on any map, and now she was using it to track the slow dissolution of her civilian life. She kept working. She kept showing up. She kept her mouth shut and her face neutral and her hand steady, the way training had taught her. But she began keeping her jacket in her locker instead of hanging it on the staff room hook. She checked the lining where the faded unit patch was sewn, the way soldiers do with lucky coins and prayers. Still there. Still proof that she was more than what they thought. Still a time bomb nobody knew was ticking. The worst part wasn't the whispers. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer was being brilliant about it. He wasn't making accusations. He was asking questions. He wasn't calling her incompetent. He was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, her background deserved clarification. He was giving her enough rope while maintaining complete plausible deniability, the kind that would make any HR department look foolish if they tried to prove harassment. This was the work of a man who had learned how to destroy people without leaving evidence. What happened next didn't just change the game. It made the game irrelevant. 2:30 in the morning tastes like stale coffee and fluorescent hum. The vending machine outside the break room hissed its mechanical wheeze as Natalie fed $1 into the slot, her fingers steady on the button. Cheese crackers. The protein bar was cheaper per ounce, but she'd learned years ago that calories meant less than consistency. The machine clattered, and the bag dropped. A resident she'd mentored 3 months ago taught him how to read a femoral pulse when the monitor was lying, shown him the exact angle for a subclavian line that wouldn't shred the pleura, walked past the vending machine without looking. His eyes found the wall, the floor, anywhere that wasn't her face. That was new. Yesterday he'd nodded. The day before, he'd asked her opinion. Today, he was a ghost passing through the same space. Natalie didn't pause. Didn't look up from the vending machine. Her hands moved with the same efficiency they always did, withdrawing the crackers, checking the time on her phone, 2:31 a.m. The ER was running at 147% capacity tonight. They needed competence more than politics. Dr. Mercer appeared at the corner like he'd been waiting for the exact moment of vulnerability, though there was no vulnerability to find. He stood with his arms crossed, his stethoscope draped like a royal sash across his shoulders, and his voice carried the weight of institutional authority. "Nurse Hayes." Not a greeting. A summons. Security protocol requires that staff with credential discrepancies be escorted during shift changes. For safety purposes, you understand. There it was. The escalation. Not whispered anymore. Direct. Public. Turning hospital policy into a weapon, the kind of weapon that looked reasonable if you didn't examine it too closely. Natalie straightened the bag of crackers in her hands. Turned to face him with the expression of someone who had simply been interrupted while buying dinner. "I'm aware of the protocol, Dr. Mercer. I've worked here for 3 years without incident. Policy is policy." His smile had teeth in it. "We're simply taking precautions. Until the background review concludes, you'll be accompanied to and from your vehicle at shift end. I've already notified security. They're quite understanding about the arrangement." The words hung there like a diagnosis. Not an accusation, just procedure. Just caution. Just the very reasonable action of an institution protecting itself from an unknown element. The genius of it was that he didn't have to prove anything. He only had to make her presence feel like a question mark. She pressed the bag against her thigh. Looked at him with the kind of stillness that came from having already decided not to fight. "Thank you for the notification, Dr. Mercer. I'll be sure to wait at the entrance." She walked past him toward the stairs. His voice followed her. "By the way, I've been reviewing some of your recent interventions. Fascinating work. Not quite standard for nursing scope." Then, quieter, "We'll want to discuss that properly." The ER bay erupted 20 minutes later with the arrival of a surgical case that would redefine the next 4 hours. The stretcher came in fast, wheels squeaking against tile, and the paramedics were calling out vitals like a song they'd rehearsed 100 times. 28-year-old male, blunt trauma to the abdomen, RTC at mile marker 4 on 285. Distended belly, signs of peritonitis, BP dropping from initial 160 to 118. ETA to surgery 8 minutes. A surgeon was already moving toward trauma bay 3, but it was Dr. Mercer who intercepted the patient first, doing the cursory exam that took no longer than a poem. His hands were smooth. Soft. The hands of someone who'd learned to touch people with institutional care rather than actual intimacy. He turned to the attending. "Appendicitis, almost certainly. But we'll need imaging before we open. Get a CT, type and cross for units. Page surgical to hold." The patient's abdomen was the color of old plums. His breathing was shallow, like the act of existing hurt. His eyes were the color of Helmand province dust, that particular, exact shade of sun-baked earth and memory, and they fixed on Natalie for just long enough that she knew what he was seeing. Not what he was seeing. What he was recognizing. The surgical resident was 26, maybe 27, and his hands were shaking. This detail mattered. His hands had started steady enough when he'd scrubbed in for the appendectomy, but the moment the attending had stepped out to take a call, something about a medical board inquiry, something urgent, the resident had looked down at the patient's open abdomen like he was staring into an abyss that was staring back. His tremor started in his fingers. Moved to his wrists. By the time he was trying to identify the appendiceal base, his hands were moving like someone trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. Dr. Mercer was in the observation gallery, arms crossed, watching. Always watching. Natalie stood at the anesthesia station, monitoring the patient's vitals, and she watched the resident's hand shake. She watched him search for the anatomy that should have been obvious. She watched the attending surgeon, 30 miles away in a conference room dealing with administrative nightmares, miss the fact that his resident was drowning in real time. The patient's O2 was dropping. 78%. 74. The CO2 in the abdomen was expanding, pushing against the diaphragm, making the lungs work harder for less oxygen. The resident's hands shook harder. His attending wasn't coming back. Not in time. Natalie moved without permission. Without protocol. She stepped forward and placed her hands just outside his in the surgical field, not touching the instruments, just present. Her voice was a frequency that only he could hear. Second layer is the viscera. You're looking for the appendix at the base of the cecum. It's going to feel like a small tube, about the size of a pen. Your fingers know this. Let them work. The resident's breath came in sharp, panic pulls. His eyes were wet. She continued, the same tone, not correcting, instructing, your grandfather was a surgeon. You've seen his hands work 1,000 times. You have his muscle memory. Not his fear. His memory. It wasn't true, probably. But it became true the moment she said it. The resident's hand steadied. Not completely. But enough. Enough to feel the appendix. Enough to identify it correctly. Enough to isolate the mesoappendix with the kind of precision that comes from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. His hands moved like they remembered things his mind had forgotten, muscle memory from watching, from studying, from the particular genetic inheritance of surgical skill passed down through generations of doctors who understood that confidence was just controlled panic wearing a white coat. O2 climbing. 78. 82. 86. Stable. The appendix came free cleanly. The resident looked at his own hands like they belonged to someone else, someone capable, someone who'd actually done this instead of merely survived it. His voice was barely audible. I did that. You did. Natalie was already stepping back, already becoming invisible again, already preparing to be the person everyone would forget about in 3 minutes. But the patient's eyes opened mid-sedation, a moment where the anesthesia was transitioning, where consciousness bled through like light under a closed door, and his gaze found her face. That Helm and Province stare. That particular recognition of someone who'd bled in the same dirt you'd bled in. He stared at her hands. At her suture work, precise and economical, each not exactly the tension it needed to be and no more. He stared at the way she moved around the surgical field like the space itself organized itself around her presence. And then his voice came, slurred and half-conscious, cutting through the hum of the monitor and the soft sounds of instruments being cleaned. You were a combat medic. Not a question. A statement. A recognition. A name for something he'd seen before, in field hospitals where the surgical precision mattered more than it ever would in a teaching facility, where the difference between a clean suture line and a rushed one was the difference between walking out whole and walking out compromised. The resident didn't hear. Dr. Mercer, watching from the observation gallery, heard. Natalie moved without hesitation. Brought her finger to her lips, that ancient gesture, and held the patient's gaze long enough for him to understand. Don't speak this. Don't name this. Don't let this moment become a record. Then she turned away. Returned to the monitor. Made herself small, competent, invisible, the way she'd been invisible for 3 years at St. Michael's, the way she'd been invisible in Atlanta's civilian corridors since the morning they'd put her in a car with a false identity and a new social security number and told her to forget Captain Natalie Hayes had ever existed. The OR settled back into its rhythm. Equipment beeped. Monitors hummed their mechanical lullaby. The resident finished closing while Natalie watched his hands move with the confidence of someone who'd just learned they were capable of impossible things. In exactly 4 hours, Dr. Mercer would file a report detailing a dangerous pattern of insubordination, unauthorized procedure performance, and scope creep that posed patient safety risks. He would include a video of the appendectomy. He would include statements from 3 nurses who'd been coached to remember incidents that had never happened. He would make 3 phone calls, one to his golf partner on the hospital board, one to the state licensing investigator, and one to the administrator, marked urgent, marked personal, marked with the kind of concern that only sounds reasonable until you understand what it's really trying to accomplish. But that would come later. For now, in the stillness after the surgery, Natalie checked her phone to find 17 minutes until the end of her shift. She had 17 minutes to clean up the OR, to document what had happened in the surgical record with perfect clinical precision, to walk to the parking lot and wait for security to escort her to her car like a suspect who might flee at any moment. She had 17 minutes of invisibility left before the whole world changed. She took them quietly, the way she'd taken everything else. The paramedic crew wheeled the stretcher through the automatic doors like they were hauling cargo that might explode. 32-year-old male, airborne insertion, blunt force trauma to the left thorax. The man's skin had gone the color of old newspaper. One lung wasn't working. You could hear it in the way he gasped, a sound like wind through a broken window. Dr. Kellerman stood at the trauma bay entrance, arms crossed, studying the chest X-ray on the monitor. His jaw worked silently. The trachea had shifted. Classic presentation. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis was obvious. What wasn't obvious was why he wasn't moving. "We need to decompress," Natalie said. Not a question. Statement of fact. The kind of voice that came from muscle memory, from 3 years of suppressing every instinct to lead. Dr. Kellerman hesitated. Looked at the resident beside him. The resident looked at the monitor. Nobody moved. The paratrooper's oxygen saturation was dropping. 94. 90. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, fighting against a pressure that shouldn't be building. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were counting down something. Natalie was already moving. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for the hierarchy to perform its ritual. Hands moving on their own, reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart. The plastic wrapper crinkled, a sound like dried leaves underfoot. She prepped the site. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The textbook location. The place where you pushed a needle between ribs when a lung collapsed and started crushing the heart. "I'm the attending here," Dr. Kellerman started. She wasn't listening. The needle went in. Just below the clavicle. Through the skin. Through the muscle. The ribs were solid barriers, but she angled it, knowing the anatomy the way some people know their own heartbeat. The air was trapped in the pleural space, pressurized, turning his lung into a collapsed balloon. 1 centimeter. 2. The needle advanced. Then the hiss. That sound. That exact sound. The rush of compressed air escaping back through the needle like someone had punctured a tire. She'd heard it 23 times in field hospitals that officially never existed. 23 times in 18 months. Never got old. Never stopped meaning the same thing, the pressure was releasing. The lung could expand again. The heart could beat without something crushing it. His oxygen saturation climbed. 92. 95. 98. 100. The paralysis in the room broke. A nurse moved to stabilize the fall line. The resident exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a week. Dr. Kellerman's face had gone very still. Natalie placed a chest tube dressing over the needle site and stepped back. The paratrooper's eyes were half open, pupils blown from the sedative, but his chest was rising and falling normally. Symmetric breath sounds returning. Sinus rhythm steady on the monitor. She didn't celebrate. Didn't acknowledge the save. She'd already turned to the supply cart, her expression neutral as February rain. But Dr. Kellerman watched her from the corner of his eye, and something in his face shifted. Not fear. Fury. He'd just watched a trauma nurse perform a procedure that was supposed to be his domain. In front of the resident. In front of the nursing staff. In front of his authority, which had suddenly become very small. She didn't see him step into the hallway. Didn't see him pull his phone out before the paratrooper's chest tube was even fully secured. She was documenting the vital signs, the procedure, the time it took, 2:33 p.m., Decompression successful, patient stabilized. Routine. Clean. By protocol. By protocol. That would matter very soon. But not the way she meant it. Dr. Mercer's first call took 3 minutes. His golfing partner, Stephen Blackwell, sat on the hospital board. Mercer's voice on the phone was calm, almost conversational. "We have an issue with staff credentialing. A nurse just performed a procedure way outside her scope. I need you to look into her background." Quietly. The second call came faster. To the State Licensing Board. "I'm requesting a full investigation into Captain," he'd caught himself. "Into Natalie Hayes. Credential discrepancies. Unauthorized interventions. Whatever you need, I'll cooperate fully." The email went to hospital administration at 3:15 p.m. Subject line, urgent, patient safety concern. He detailed the needle decompression procedure. Described it as a reckless intervention despite clear medical oversight. Mentioned that her background might warrant additional scrutiny. Typed with the precision of a man who knew how to make problems look official. How to make questions look reasonable. How to make a person disappear without ever touching her. By 4 p.m., Natalie was called to the administrator's office. She knew. The moment she saw the printed letter on his desk, she knew. 3 years of careful invisibility. 3 years of being the quiet nurse who asked no questions and answered all of them. 3 years of keeping the patch hidden inside her jacket lining, stitched to the lining of a jacket she never wore outside the hospital. 3 years of pretending to be someone forgettable. One procedure had been enough. Credential discrepancies, the administrator read aloud, though both of them could see the words. Unauthorized medical interventions beyond your scope of practice. These actions constitute a violation of hospital protocol and patient safety standards. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. The letter was already printed. Already signed. Already done. What discrepancies? Natalie's voice was flat. Clinical. The way you asked about lab results. The background investigation is ongoing. We can't discuss specifics while it's active. He slid the letter toward her. Security will escort you out. 15 minutes to clear your locker. She didn't argue. Didn't defend. She'd been trained by people who understood that words were often the most dangerous weapon in an ambush. She nodded and stood up. The locker was in the break room. She cleared it methodically. The photo of James in his dress blues, captain's bars bright on his shoulder, green eyes looking at something beyond the camera, beyond the frame, beyond this world. She placed it carefully in the cardboard box. The dying succulent from her nurse's station, leaves curled like old paper. A cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom" in faded paint. Marcus had made it when he was 6. She'd carried it for 11 years. Then her hand went to her jacket pocket. Inside the lining, stitched close to the fabric so no one would ever notice it unless they looked. The unit patch. Faded olive drab. A nightingale insignia with 6 small stars. Operational designation Sentinel. Her call sign. Her rank. Her identity. She'd stitched it in on a Tuesday night in her apartment, the needle moving carefully through the silk lining, creating a map only she could read. She pulled her jacket off and set it on the locker bench. Located the seam. Started to work the thread loose with her fingernail. Security was waiting in the doorway. 2 of them. Young. Uncomfortable. "We need to escort you now." She stopped. Left the jacket. Left the patch. Left everything that wasn't hers to carry anymore. The cardboard box felt light in her hands. Everything she'd kept close was fragile enough to fit in a box. Everything she'd protected fit in a box. Everything that mattered fit in a box. The walk through the ER took forever. Felt like walking through a museum of a life that wasn't hers anymore. Past the trauma bay where the paratrooper was being prepped for transfer to the ICU. He tried to sit up when he saw her. Tried to move. The nurse pushed him back down gently, and he watched Natalie disappear through the automatic doors like he was watching something slip away from him. Rain. Heavy Atlanta downpour. The kind that comes out of nowhere and means business. She sat at the bus stop 3 blocks away, the cardboard box on her lap. Water soaked through the cardboard. The termination letter turned into pulp. The ink ran like it was crying. She didn't move. Didn't open an umbrella she didn't have. Just sat and let the rain mix with everything else. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. Mom, where are you? You didn't pick me up from practice. She texted back, I'll be late. Sorry. Didn't tell him why. Didn't know how to say that she'd been erased in one afternoon. That the careful construct of invisibility had collapsed the moment she'd saved someone's life. That staying hidden meant accepting death. That stepping into the light meant losing everything. The bus came. She didn't board. Just sat with the rain and the box and the photo of James staring up through plastic, asking her without words why she'd ever thought silence was the same as safety. The hospital boardroom doors burst open at 8:19 a.m., and Marcus Hayes walked through them like he was carrying the weight of his entire life in a wooden shadow box. 17 years old. Fury burning so hot behind his eyes that the administrative staff actually leaned back in their chairs. His voice cracked on the first word, but the words themselves were steel. Mom, they need to see these, you can't let them do this to you. He set the shadow box on the polished conference table with the careful precision of someone handling a grenade. Inside, medals on ribbons. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. And beneath them, a folded uniform jacket with a unit patch that made the room's oxygen content drop by half. Natalie rose from the chair where she'd sat in silence for the termination meeting. Her eyes found her son's face and didn't leave it. The administrator started to speak, something about this being outside the scope of the hearing, but the paratrooper in the wheelchair rolled forward, cutting through the words like a trauma bay nurse through a crowded hallway. He was still jaundiced from the blood loss, still moving like each breath cost something. His left hand trembled where it gripped the armrest, but his voice didn't. It dropped to a whisper so precise it felt like a command. Nightingale 6. That was your call sign. The name hung in the air like a ghost materializing in daylight. The Marine Corps officer who'd been visiting his cousin in pediatrics heard the words from the hallway and stepped through the open doorway. He was carrying a phone, scrolling to something he'd pulled up 30 seconds earlier. His uniform was dress blues. His jaw was set like he'd been waiting for this moment since the day he'd heard she'd disappeared from active records. He read from the screen without inflection, each word a nail being driven into the silence. Captain Natalie Hayes. Bronze Star with Valor. For actions under fire while treating casualties during a 14-hour siege in Helmand Province, 2009. He looked up. That's published. That's official. That exists. Dr. Mercer moved to interrupt, his hands were rising, his mouth opening with something rehearsed and dismissive, but the doors opened again. A general in dress uniform entered. Not a video call. Not a representative. The actual general from her classified operation, the one who'd debriefed her in a tent that no longer appeared on any map, who'd told her the mission was so deep that her existence would create more questions than answers. He was 63, with scars on his neck that told their own stories, and he saluted the shadow box before he said a word. The salute landed like an axe. Then his voice, which sounded like a tank idling in a garage, Captain Hayes held a trauma bay against enemy fire, saving 11 operators when evacuation was impossible. That's not Valor. That's prophecy. He looked directly at Dr. Mercer. You questioned her credentials. The words that came next belonged to 2 Pentagon officials who'd arrived in the parking lot at 8:44 a.m., 2 minutes before Marcus pushed through the doors. One of them was holding a tablet. The other was holding a folder thick enough to be a novel. The first one spoke directly to the hospital administrator, and his voice had the flat precision of someone reading a grocery list that happened to be a death sentence. Sentinel remains on the active reserve list for Special Forces medical operations. She's been consulting with SOCOM for 18 months. Her clearance is top secret SCI. The second official opened his folder. The background investigation Dr. Mercer initiated has triggered a comprehensive review of his own record. 12 surgical outcomes reported as successes were actually post-operative complications. Research grants from 2018 to 2021 show expenditures that don't match any published work. $342,000. Unaccounted for. Dr. Mercer's face went from pale to crimson to a shade of white that looked like surrender. This is a coordinated attack because I dared to hold someone accountable. The general cut him off with a single raised hand. The gesture carried more authority than any words. The surgical resident, the one who'd walked past Natalie without acknowledgement just 2 weeks earlier, the one whose hands had trembled during the appendectomy, entered from the hallway. His voice was shaking, but he spoke anyway. Dr. Mercer submitted that surgery under his name. But Captain Hayes, she's the one who talked me through it. Every single step. She could have let me fail. She didn't. The Marine Corps officer opened his phone again. I've been in contact with 3 other medical staff who trained under Captain Hayes in theater. They filed statements about your claims of combat experience. The problem is, you were never in theater. Your CV says 12 months with 160th SAW Medical. The records say you were in a stateside training rotation. The general stepped closer to Dr. Mercer, and the room's air pressure changed. Which unit did you claim? Dr. Mercer didn't answer. His mouth moved without sounds. The Pentagon official with the folder pulled out a printed document. Falsifying military service credentials in an application for hospital privileges is a federal offense. We're referring this to the Office of Inspector General. The hospital administrator's face had gone the color of old newsprint. She looked at Dr. Mercer the way someone looks at a chair that suddenly revealed itself to be a snake. The nursing director produced her own folder, thicker than the Pentagon officials, which nobody expected. 6 formal complaints against Dr. Mercer spanning 3 years. All marked "Do not escalate." All buried. She placed them on the table without speaking. Security was called at 9:03 a.m., and they were told to escort Dr. Mercer from the building, not to detain him, just to make sure he understood that his presence was no longer wanted in any capacity. His medical license was suspended pending federal investigation before he even reached the parking lot. The board chairman had already made the call to the state licensing authority while he was still in the room. The administrator turned to Natalie. Her voice had changed. It wasn't an apology yet, it was something smaller and more dangerous, the voice of someone who realizes they've been weaponized by a predator. We're reinstating you immediately. Full back pay. And we need your help designing a trauma protocol that actually works. Real protocol, not corporate theater. Natalie didn't respond right away. She was looking at her son. Marcus was crying, but his shoulders were straight. He understood something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in how the world saw his mother. The paratrooper was smiling for the first time since he'd arrived in the ER fighting for breath. The general gave a single nod, not respect, but recognition. 2 warriors acknowledging each other across a room full of people who'd just learned they'd been standing next to a legend. 6 months later, the world had rearranged itself around that moment like dominoes falling in reverse. Natalie walked through the ER of St. Michael's in the afternoon light, and something about her had become visible. The faded Special Forces unit patch was sewn to the outside of her jacket now, no longer hidden in the lining where it had lived for 3 years like a secret. It caught the fluorescent light every time she moved. Residents asked her questions with voices that had shifted from deferential to genuinely respectful. She was teaching now, combat medicine seminars that filled the hospital's auditorium, techniques learned in places that didn't exist, protocols written in blood instead of policy manuals. The nursing director had promoted her to senior trauma nurse and created a new position, combat medicine instructor. Marcus was volunteering in the ER after school, shadowing his mother through shifts, and he'd applied to 3 nursing schools already. The surgical resident had asked her to review his trauma protocol paper. She'd agreed. In the hospital parking lot, on a Tuesday morning when the weather was exactly the kind of clear that makes everything look too sharp, Dr. Mercer was loading medical supplies into a white van. Court-ordered community service. 500 hours. Part of his plea agreement after the federal charges had accumulated like snow. His medical license was permanently revoked. The falsified research had triggered a full audit of every study he'd ever published. 3 of them had been retracted. 2 of his colleagues had resigned rather than face the same scrutiny. He wore a bright orange volunteer vest that made him look like a construction worker, which is essentially what he'd become. A man whose credentials had been stripped down to nothing, left with labor and humility and a future that smelled like disinfectant and regret. Natalie walked past with Marcus, her hand on his shoulder. She didn't look at Dr. Mercer. Didn't need to. The universe had already done the looking. He didn't look up from the van. The paratrooper, now fully recovered, his lungs clear, his color back, had met Natalie for coffee in the hospital cafeteria 3 weeks earlier. He was advocating now for military-trained medical personnel in civilian hospitals, had already spoken to 2 congressional committees, and was working on legislation. General Kane had offered Natalie a consulting position training Special Forces medics on weekends only, so she could stay with Marcus. She was still thinking about it. The photo of James in dress blues, her husband, the one who hadn't made it out of Helmand, now sat on her desk in the nurse's station instead of hidden in a box under her bed. Marcus would look at it sometimes between shifts and understand in a way that didn't require words. An envelope arrived at the hospital at 4:15 p.m. on a Thursday. It was addressed to Captain Natalie Hayes. The letterhead was from the White House. An invitation to a ceremony honoring military medical personnel who'd served in classified operations. 5 hours after saving the paratrooper's life, she'd been sitting at a bus stop in the rain with everything she owned in a cardboard box. Now, 6 months later, she'd stand in a room with presidents and generals and Medal of Honor recipients, and nobody would ever question whether she belonged there again. The last image of Natalie that matters is this: the nurse's station at St. Michael's, 6:22 p.m. on a Thursday, the evening shift coming alive with activity. She's training a new resident in needle decompression technique, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, under fire, with 3 operators bleeding out and no helicopter coming. The faded unit patch is visible on her jacket. The resident's hands are steady because she's teaching him the truth instead of the fear. She talks him through the placement of the needle, the angle, the depth, 2.4 centimeters. Feel for the resistance. That's the muscle. The next chamber is air, and then you'll feel the release. Her voice has dropped an octave from where it started. This is the voice of someone who's been forged in places that break ordinary people. This is the voice of a captain who'd spent 3 years being called just a nurse and had responded with a silence that was actually restraint. The surgical resident who'd frozen during the appendectomy is watching from across the room. The administrator who'd signed the termination paperwork is reviewing Natalie's new trauma protocols, which are being adopted by 12 other hospitals. The paratrooper is writing thank you emails to General Kane and every officer who'd shown up that morning in the boardroom. Dr. Mercer is loading a van in a parking lot somewhere, and the only person who remembers his face is someone who'd learned not to waste memory on people who'd failed to see her. If you've made it this far, you already know the truth that the hospital learned that morning: the quietest person in the room might just be holding it all together. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes nobody expects. Like this video if you believe quiet strength deserves recognition. And comment, tell us about a time you were underestimated by someone who didn't know your story.